The rain didn't begin like an ending. At first, it was the soft kind, drumming on rooftops, tap-tapping on window glass, making the city smell like wet earth and old brick. People filmed it from balconies and joked about forgotten umbrellas. The weather anchors smiled too wide. Then the clouds didn't move for 3 days. On the 4th day, the sky turned the color of bruised metal, and the rain came down in sheets so thick it looked like the world had been wrapped in a waterfall. Rivers that had always kept their manners climbed out of their banks like angry animals. Storm drains coughed. Streets became canals. The trees in the parks bowed and shivered as if they were praying. Somewhere above it all, airplanes circled in nervous loops, their bellies lit like pale fish in a dark sea of cloud. On the real sea, ships fought waves that rose and fell like mountains, their horns moaning into the wind, long, lonely notes that didn't reach anybody. The flood didn't just arrive. It took storefronts first, and then cars, and then the first floors of apartment buildings. It pushed through walls that had stood for decades, snapping them the way the ocean snaps sandcastles. It uprooted gardens. It drowned fields. It tore plants from the ground and spun them through the streets in green, twisting ropes. The news called it unprecedented. That word sounded too clean for what it did to families. In the chaos, people became small dots in a huge, moving map, running, climbing, shouting names into the roar. A father on a rooftop waving a shirt. A mother holding a child above her head as the current pulled at her waist. Neighbors forming chains with their arms and breaking apart when the water surged. And somewhere in the middle of the storm was a school bus. It was coming back from a trip. Children tired and sticky with laughter, backpacks full of wrappers and souvenirs. The bus driver gripped the steering wheel with both hands, eyes narrowed against the rain. The road ahead had been there yesterday. Now it was a broad, fast river. The bus slowed, tires humming, then stopped. A wave struck from the side like a punch. The bus rocked. One child screamed. Another grabbed a seat back. The driver shouted, "Stay down! Hold on!" Outside, the world was no longer made of streets and sidewalks. It was a moving, furious ocean carrying pieces of rooftops, branches, signs, and someone's bright red bicycle. The bus began to slide. It slid sideways at first, slow, stubborn, as if refusing to believe it could be moved. Then the current caught it properly and the whole heavy vehicle lurched like a toy. The water shoved it toward an intersection where the asphalt had broken open into a hungry, spinning mouth. Inside, the children cried out for parents who couldn't hear them. A girl near the window pressed her palm to the glass and saw, through the curtain of rain, a shape where no shape should be. Something enormous moved along the edge of the flood. Black fur soaked and shining, shoulders like boulders, arms longer than the bus was wide. A gorilla. It wasn't a storybook gorilla with gentle eyes and perfect calm. This one was wild and real and breathing hard, its chest rising and falling like a drum. The water slapped against its legs and tried to drag it, but it braced itself against the trunk of a half-submerged tree and held. For a heartbeat, the girl thought she was hallucinating from fear. Then the gorilla stepped into the flood. It waded in with slow, deliberate power, using broken lampposts and the remains of fences like stepping stones. The current clawed at its body. Debris struck its shoulders. Still it came. The bus tipped as it reached the edge of the broken road. The driver screamed something that vanished in the roar, and the gorilla lunged. It reached the bus the way someone reaches a falling child, without hesitation, without calculation. One massive hand clamped onto the bus's metal frame. The other grabbed a thick cable hanging from a snapped power line, then another. Strong cords of steel and wire that had once held up the city's lights. With astonishing speed, it looped the cables around the bus like a net. The children watched, frozen, as the gorilla hauled the bus upward. Not into the sky, not like magic, into the space above the flood, to the highest point it could reach. The skeleton of a billboard frame that still clung to its poles, bent but not yet broken. The gorilla climbed, muscles straining, teeth bared against the rain, and pulled the bus until it hung there, suspended, swaying like a giant lantern over the raging water. The bus dangled on those cables, creaking, safe only because something stronger than the flood had decided it would be. Inside, the children went quiet, not because they were calm, but because they were alive. And for a moment, they didn't know what to do with that fact. The driver choked out a breath. "Okay," he said, voice trembling. "Okay, listen. Stay seated. We're okay." Outside, the gorilla clung to the billboard frame, one arm hooked around a pole, the other steadying the hanging bus as the wind tried to swing it, its fur plastered to its body. Rain streamed down its face. It looked up at the bus windows, and the children saw its eyes. Dark, tired, alert, not friendly, not cruel, just determined. The flood raged for hours after that. It tore the world open and kept going, as if it had lost all sense of when to stop. The city's lights vanished, the phones died, the sky was a single heavy scream. But the bus stayed hanging, and the gorilla stayed holding. When the rain finally thinned and the water began to drop, slowly, grudgingly, people emerged like survivors from another planet. They stepped across mud and wreckage, calling names into the damp air, hoping a voice would answer. By morning, the streets were unrecognizable. Buildings leaned at strange angles. Whole blocks looked as if giant hands had scooped them up and thrown them down. The plants that had once softened the city, flower beds, shrubs, potted trees, lay scattered and broken, green life flattened into brown sludge. On the horizon, a ship listed in the harbor like a wounded creature. Far above, a lone airplane passed through a tear in the clouds, its engines humming, one small, stubborn line of movement in a world that felt stopped. And then someone saw the bus. It hung there, above a shallow lake of muddy water, and beneath it, sitting in the shadow of the billboard poles, was the gorilla. The children were alive. They were scared, hungry, shivering. Some had scrapes and bruises. Some clutched each other so tightly their hands shook. The gorilla had not left them. When the bus door finally opened, when rescuers climbed up and helped the children down one by one, they realized something that made them pause. The gorilla had been gathering food, not human food exactly because the world didn't have stores anymore. But it had found what it could. Fruit knocked from flooded trees, bundles of leaves that could be chewed for moisture, even a half-dry pile of bread someone must have dropped in the rush. It had kept it away from the mud under a piece of corrugated metal, as if it had learned, somehow, that cleanliness mattered when children were involved. It had also built a kind of shelter, a nest of branches and torn fabric and plastic sheeting tucked against the poles where the wind was weakest. Crude, but thoughtful, a place for small bodies to huddle. A rescuer, a woman with mud on her cheeks and a rope around her waist, raised her hands slowly and spoke softly, like you speak to anything that has suffered. "You did good," she whispered, as if the gorilla could understand words. "You did so good." The gorilla didn't roar. It didn't pound its chest. It simply sat, watching the last child climb down. One boy, the smallest, held a stuffed toy soaked and sagging. He stopped at the bottom of the ladder, looked up at the gorilla's massive face, and, because children do brave things without knowing they're brave, he lifted his hand and gave a small, shaky wave. For a long moment, the gorilla stared at him. Then it extended one huge finger and tapped the billboard pole lightly as if to say, "You're steady now. You can go." When the rescuers led the children away, the gorilla followed at a distance, not close enough to scare them, not far enough to abandon them. It moved through wreckage and silence like a guardian carved from the storm. In the days that followed, the world tried to remember itself. Families found each other in shelters and lists and photographs pinned to walls. Some names were called and never answered, and the grief was heavy, but people still brought blankets to strangers, still shared water, still held hands in the dark. They cleared roads. They planted seedlings in buckets. They made soup out of whatever they could salvage. And among them, always nearby, was the gorilla. It helped without being asked, pulling fallen beams so humans could crawl through, nudging debris aside with careful strength, standing like a wall between frightened children and anything that might harm them. When it rested where it could see them. Some said it was impossible. Some said it was a miracle. Some said it was nature apologizing for what it had done. But the children, those children who had dangled above the end of the world in a bus held up by cables and courage, didn't call it any of those things. They called it hope with fur. They remembered that when the flood tried to erase everything, something enormous had chosen to hold on. And long after the water receded, long after new buildings rose and new trees grew, the story traveled across the rebuilt world like a warm light. When the world fell apart, a gorilla lifted a bus into the air and refused to let the children fall. Because sometimes, when everything is being destroyed, the most powerful thing left is the decision to protect what can still be saved.